Well, I think two things stood out for me. One is the production budget. Yes, $75 is a lot of money, but if you compare it to a lot of the budgets for like a typical Marvel film, 75 million is on the low end. Even Dunkirk, comparatively speaking, has a production budget of 90 to 100 million. Same thing with 1917. And you could say that, yes, those are historical movies, but there's a blockbuster element to them. So the fact that Paul Greengrass made the Bourne Supremacy for $75 million is really, really impressive. And the other thing is, I'm a little surprised that the Rotten Tomato score is like 82%, because I would have definitely given it like 92, 93%. I really think that, I know if I'm not mistaken, the Bourne Ultimatum has a higher RT score, but I still like, I would rank the Bourne Supremacy up there with one of the best movies of that particular genre. So it's weird. I had no idea the score was 84.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing too. I was shocked to see that it was in the low 80s because I thought for sure this movie would be in the 90s. That tells me that there's a certain amount of people that don't like this movie, which is shocking to me. I mean, even
Very
if you
shocking.
even if it's not your genre, I feel like you could at least appreciate like the cinematography, you could appreciate the writing, the direction, the acting. I feel like there's so many good things working in this movie's favor
Mhm.
that yeah, so that number is pretty shocking to me too. I guess one thing that kind of stood out to me too, looking back at these movies, is I was surprised at how short the run times were. I mean, these were cut really, really thin, but I mean, not in a bad way, obviously, because
Mhm.
they're very good movies. But I was shocked at how short the run times were. All of them were under 2 hours.
Well, it's interesting because I was watching Hollywood Reporters Roundtable. They do roundtable discussions with actors and writers and directors pretty much every year. And they have one with a lot of the writers from some of the biggest films of this particular year, including Jordan Peele and Martin McDonough and Ryan Johnson. And Ryan Johnson was talking about like, what's the favorite runtime, or what's like the perfect runtime for movies? Because movies these days are kind of becoming kind of bloated. And the Batman, for example, is 3 hours long. The Fablemans, which is a movie I just saw, is 2.5 hours. A lot of these movies are getting kind of longer and longer. And Ryan Johnson basically said, the sweet spot for me is 85 minutes. And if you look at the Bourne movies, they're short, they're efficient, and they don't overstay their welcome. And a part of, I think, their appeal is that they're very lean, economical films when it comes to their storytelling and their filmmaking. And for me, it's one of the reasons why I like them, because I love a good long movie. Lawrence of Arabia is one of my favorite movies. It's 4 hours long. Of course, we both love the Snyder Cut, which is a 4 hour movie.
Right.
But, there's something to be said, especially in the spy genre, about being, I think, very deliberate with its storytelling and being very kind of economical, and the pacing and the story structure. And yeah, those movies I think are just really, really well paced.
I feel like nowadays, when people think of a short runtime for a movie, usually because movies are generally longer now than they have been in the past, I feel like people automatically assume, oh my goodness, it's not good. They're gutting the movie, right? Because we usually
Mm-hmm.
think of comic book movies, right?
Sure.
And usually, if it's a short runtime for so many of them, for whatever reason, that seems to be the case. So there's
Mm-hmm.
just like this gut, like reaction of like, oh no, like we're cutting out important stuff in this movie that we need. When it's funny because with these movies, like, and we'll get into maybe more of this a little bit later too, but it doesn't feel like anything is like, everything is structured in a way where it's like you have everything you need in front of you. I mean, it's the most full hour, 48-minute runtime you can imagine, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Well, and I attribute that a lot to Tony Gilroy. And, he worked on the scripts for, I think, all the movies. However, I know that with the Bourne Ultimatum, Paul Greengrass and Christopher Rouse, who is the film's editor, I think did a polish on that screenplay. So Gilroy had a little bit less to do with Ultimatum than he did with, let's say, Identity or Supremacy. But, Gilroy is one of the best writers in the business. And, if you've seen Michael Clayton, you can like recognize his talents very strongly. And of course, most recently in Andor, which I think is one of the best pieces of Star Wars media I've seen, and it's absolutely fantastic. And he's just a really, really good writer. And I think that his writing really anchors the movie in the sense that, every scene has a purpose, every character arc is very precisely written, and he knows exactly what he's doing when it comes to the theme and the pacing. And so I just think that, you know, a lot of modern action films and a lot of films in general can learn a thing or two about these movies, because you don't need to have a 3 hour runtime. Yes, if it's, you know, servicing the story, then that's justifiable. But there's something to be said about a lean, economical story. And that's one of the reasons why I love these movies.
Absolutely, yeah. And to be honest, I kind of take the same sort of approach with my podcast. You know, everybody says that, you know, like what's the perfect, you know, length of the podcast? Is it 45 minutes? Is it 3 hours? Right? To me, it's as long as it needs to be, right? And
For sure.
the same goes to storytelling, right? It
Mm-hmm.
depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell. And you know,
Mm-hmm.
if you're trying to tell this big, huge, epic kind of story, you need a longer runtime just to really set that up, right? So,
Absolutely.
but if you, but like, you know, like you had mentioned, if you are kind of like you said, a leaner, economical kind of story that doesn't need to be this huge epic, it's just all you need to know is this character and what they're doing, and some of it you can kind of learn on the way. And I feel like that kind of helps with these kind of stories too. Is you're kind of learning what's happening. You're learning the audience is learning with some of the characters, or in terms of through the storytelling, you're learning what's happening or what these
Mm-hmm.
characters are doing and who they are on the fly. And in some cases, I think that almost works better in an instance. But to me, anyway, so it depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell. It's like that's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, absolutely. I think another good example is if you look at the X-Men movies. First X-Men movie, I think, is around an hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes. And I actually am a big fan of that original X-Men movie. But then if you look at the runtime for X-Men The Last Stand, it's pretty similar. I think it's honestly, I think an hour and 30 or an hour and 35. But it's the story is all over the place because they try to cram in too much and too many characters, and the story is just a jumbled mess. And so both films are around the same running length, but I would argue the first X-Men film handles its runtime much better. And so I think it's just a case where, yes, absolutely, the length is dependent on the story and the story you're trying to tell. But you can have a short running time and be a bad film, and you can have a short running time and be a good film. It really just depends on how you handle your characters and your story.
Yeah, and I think also how many characters can also definitely play a
Mm-hmm.
factor in that as well. Because with this
For
movie,
sure.
there's not a ton of characters really, you know, so it really allows you to focus on those characters.
It does, and I think one of the things I love about this series is that it will bring characters back, and actually, Supremacy does one thing with one of its characters, which really surprised me at the time. And as someone who is familiar with Robert Ludlum's books, does a complete like 180 in terms of what happens in those novels. But it's one of those things where, you know, they yes, they you have like this small assortment of characters, but it, you know, it gives the story time to breathe and it gives these characters time to grow. And I think, yeah, there's something to be said about not having a cast that's too robust.